Good morning. I'm here in the UK. My name is Mick Napier and I'm active in the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. This is one of our irregular but frequent conversations with people we think can add something important to the conversation on delivering effective solidarity to the people of Palestine. I'm really delighted today to welcome two guests. Shaun Whittaker from Namibia. Shaun, welcome.
Thank you so much, Mick. Thank you so much for having me for this important discussion.
And my other esteemed guest is Doris Ghannam, who's a very long-term activist with BDS Berlin. The genesis of this meeting is that I was in Berlin on Monday for a trial of three activists charged with disrupting a meeting by a minister of the Israeli government who was defending Israeli war crimes, the massacre of 2014. In conversation with folks there, it became clear that the issue of Palestine in Germany is inseparable from the whole issue of the repression of the German government towards Palestine activism and the sending of submarines and billions in aid to the state of Israel, and that it always involves some kind of attitude towards the Nazi mass killing of Jews and many, many other groups during the Second World War. And that then raised the issue of the notorious German massacre, extermination of the Herero and Nama people in German Southwest Africa, beginning of the 20th century. And we think that a discussion of that can raise very interesting issues that can help to frame how we go forward. Shaun, it's a real pleasure to have you. Sadly, the genocide of Black people isn't as well known as the genocide of Europeans. Can you tell people a broad outline of what happened and why you think it's significant? Then we can come back later to look at some of the terrible detail of what happened. Shaun.
Yes, well, once again, thank you so much for inviting me. You know, for us in Namibia, this is a very important issue. As you might know, the first genocide of the 1900s actually occurred in Namibia. And in many ways, what happened in Namibia became a model for the Nazis eventually, in terms of concentration camps, exterminating people, and the whole white supremacist ideology. So certainly the question of genocide, the question of reparations, these are explosive issues.
Shaun, we're having a small problem hearing you. Even if you would not quite swallow the microphone, but if you could go even closer to it, I think that would be a low-tech solution.
As you might know, the first genocide of the 1900s actually happened in Namibia. With the discovery of huge amounts of diamonds and gold in Southern Africa, you have to understand the Berlin Conference of 1884 in that kind of context, that clearly the European powers became very interested in Africa, in particular Southern Africa. And that was the context really within which, German soldiers began to arrive in Namibia in the late 1800s. Until eventually, of course, the local population rose up against German colonialism, and that resulted in what is called the Anti-Colonial War of Resistance, 1904 to 1908. And all the language groups in Namibia rose up against German colonialism. And it was really in that kind of context that von Trotta, the German general in Namibia, had this extermination order, in particular against the Oshierero-speaking people. And I think that is, where this issue of genocide and reparations in Namibia should start. This extermination order of Windhoek, of course, is very important. And eventually about 80% of the Oshierero-speaking people of Namibia were wiped out during this time, but also other language groups, about 10% of the Nama-speaking people, about 30% of the Damara-speaking people were also wiped out. And there were concentration camps in Windhoek, in Luderitz, in Swakopmund. We had 3 concentration camps in Namibia. And that, in many ways, became the model for the Nazis in Germany in the 1930s.
Shaun, can I ask you, the British concentration camps in South Africa preceded this by 2 or 3 years. Was there any conscious emulation of the British, or was it just a parallel development of this gruesome tactic?
No, definitely a parallel. No, definitely I think there was a level of emulation. Of course, the British, also colonized the Cape. And, one of the great heroes in Namibia, was this brilliant guerrilla fighter. And the British and the Germans actually worked together, to catch him and to kill him. So clearly there was a level of collusion between British colonialism and German colonialism to snuff out the resistance in Southern Africa. So definitely there must have been a level of, the Germans copying what the British, of course, were doing in South Africa, not very far from where we are. They understood, that they had a common agenda to subjugate the local population, and of course, to extract all the wealth. So definitely there was that level of common interest, amongst imperialists, and that is really the context for this. But in terms of, Namibia at this stage, there's tremendous anger still about the genocide and, of course, the legitimate demand for reparations. The current SWAPO government, of course, has done nothing. There is not even, some monument for the concentration camps in Luderitz, in Swakopmund. Some of these statues of these German colonialists are still up in Windhoek. In front of the Windhoek municipality, for example, there's still the statue of von Francois. So the SWAPO government clearly has done nothing about this, and I think that's.
So you mean, Shaun? I never know how to pronounce it, but the capital of Namibia, Windhoek, is there still a statue there to von Trotter or to the genocide? Is it still standing? Why hasn't it been removed?
The statue that is still there is a statue of someone called von Francois, who was also one of the German generals. That is still standing up to today. In the context of the George Floyd killing in the US, Namibian youth actually protested in front of the statue of von Francois in Windhoek. And the statue is still in front of the Windhoek municipality up to today. And of course, it tells you something about the attitude of the current government in terms of the genocide and the reparations. And it's all been about their struggle and not so much about that early history. But nevertheless, the fact of the matter is that, there's tremendous support for reparations in Namibia, from the German government.
So is it still a live issue, very much a live issue in Namibia today?
Absolutely. I don't think it is going to go away anytime soon. I think, like I said, there's still tremendous anger about what happened. And, it is absolutely a legitimate demand. There should be proper reparation for what occurred here. Interestingly, after the 1904-1908 war in Namibia, the Anti-Colonial War, the German farmers got reparations from the German government. After the Second World War, the Namibian Jewish community got reparations. So I mean, the trend, seemed to be that, colonizers get reparations, but no one else. And I think that is part of the complication of this kind of discussion. If you look at Palestine, obviously, if you look at Haiti, the colonizers tend to get reparations, not the rest of us, not the colonized.
So before I ask Doris to come in, it's really great to have you speaking from Namibia and Doris from Berlin, and I hope we'll bring people together like this again in future. But you say that there's a determination by the German government not to concede the issue of reparations. It's really quite shocking, isn't it? I mean, as far as I can see, the German government, I think they're playing the British government playbook. Individual ministers have said there's responsibility, but the government officially refuses to use the word to concede that a genocide took place, even though every scholar knows, even though von Trotter's family, I believe, went to Namibia to apologize for the genocide. Doris, have you anything to add to this? Because it's not very well known in the English-speaking world. We know a little bit about the Congo, but we don't know much about African genocides. It's not an accident. But what's your views on the attitude of the German government, Doris?
Well, what I would say is that if you go through Berlin streets or something like that, and you ask ordinary people in the street if they know anything about a genocide or something like that in Namibia, I'm sure you will not find many people who know about this story. It's not very in the public. People know who are interested in colonialism, they might know. And of course, the Black community here in Berlin and in Germany knows about it. But in general, I would say not many people, it's not an issue. To say it like this, it's not an issue. Now it's what it's getting, when you, Shaun, mentioned Lüderitz many times, the city of Lüderitz, there is a street called Lüderitz Street. Until today, there are fights that this name gets changed. I mean, there could be a name from somebody who really deserves it. But then, there are arguments not to rename the street, like it's difficult, bureaucratic reasons, you have to change your visit cards, things you get crazy about, because I mean, people were murdered, were exterminated, and you think of your visit cards.
So it's certainly Black Lives Matter less in Minnesota, but it seems that Black genocides matter less. Shaun?
Absolutely. Look, it's a reflection of the power relations. The German government does not have to take us seriously, because we are, they have the political power. I mean, Germany is, an economic and political power, globally, in Europe, definitely the most powerful. So they don't have to take us seriously. They don't have to take our demand for reparations seriously. In the same way that they can do it, not have to take the Palestinian legitimate demand seriously. It's a reflection of the difference in political power. I mean, we have to accept, as Namibians, we have to accept that at this historical stage, there will certainly never be an official apology in the Bundestag from the Chancellor. It will simply not happen. Perhaps if we have a revolutionary government in Germany, absolutely, or if we have a different global order. But the fact of the matter is that they don't have to take us seriously. That is why at this stage, I mean, look, what has happened in Namibia, why you have this talk about some apology from Germany at this stage is because the political climate has shifted in Namibia. The SWAPO government, clearly, because of their tremendous corruption, they are in so much trouble, and there is clearly tremendous radicalization of the youth that is taking place, and increasingly of the working class in Namibia as well. And the local German government, the local German community is extremely worried about this, obviously, because they have so much to lose because they control the economy to a large extent. They are the biggest landowners in Namibia. And so this talk about some form of apology from the German government has to be understood in that kind of context. The fear that you would have the same kind of situation here that happened in Zimbabwe, that Namibian youth will begin to occupy these big farms that the German farmers have, and of course German businesses as well. I mean, they've been here for 100 years. They were built on slave labor. They are extremely rich. So the local German community is obviously worried, and that's really why there's this talk about some apology from the German government and some kind of financial assistance, you see. But it will never be a formal apology, a formal, from the Bundestag. It will never. The word genocide, of course, they've consistently avoided that word because of the implications. People would immediately say, but okay, this is what you have done, in Israel, so why can't you do this in Namibia as well? So the point is, of course, the German government will determine how they do the apology and how much they will make available to the Namibians, you see. And of course, it obviously would not do justice to what occurred in Namibia.
Yeah.
But it's a reflection, and it's, of course, look, it's not only Namibia, it's not only Palestine, it reflects the political power of the global South. I mean, that's really, there were many genocides all over the world,
Can I respond? Can I come in there, Shaun, and ask both of you to comment on this? I mean, this isn't a German thing. It seems to me, though, it's difficult to discuss, it's difficult to write a history of the Nazi Holocaust from 39 to 45 without mentioning one of the people there who performed the grisly medical experiments on black people in Southwest Africa, trained a student who trained Mengele. That Franz Ritter von Epp took part in the Herero genocide and then took part in the genocide of Jews. So the same personnel seem to have been bloodied or dehumanized in German Southwest Africa, and then they carry that dehumanization into Europe. But it seems to me that many people do write about the Nazi Holocaust and airbrush Southwest Africa out of the picture. Doris, could you speak about that, and then I'll come back to Shaun, if that's okay. You're muted.
Yeah, I'm back again.
Please.
Well, you asked me to prepare something about German guilt, about the compensation Germany is paying until today to Israel, and I will show you 4 points that I have a little bit prepared. First one is compensation for National Socialist injustice, Germany's responsibility for its past. Then I will come to the Luxembourg Agreement and go on to the armament agreement, and then in the end talk about responsibility, about the hierarchy, a creation of hierarchy of the victims of Nazi Germany, and I will also talk about hypocrisy, all of it in the short, and many of it is in quotes from official websites, which you will find later what it means.
So you're talking about the hierarchy of injustices and crimes and genocides. Please go ahead.
I think this is the main, I would say this is one of the main points. So when I prepared all this, I looked on the official sites, and I found a site in the foreign ministry, and they say, and what they say is, I quote, the federal government has from the very outset made the process of providing moral and financial compensation for the crimes committed by the National Socialist regime a key priority, and continues to attach great importance to this task today. And then they continue an enduring responsibility for this most appalling period. And this paragraph starts with, speaking in the German Bundestag on 27th of September 1951, Federal Chancellor Konrad Adenauer accepted Germany's responsibility to make compensation for the deeds of the past. And now another quote, the federal government and the large majority of the German people are aware of the unspeakable suffering which, under the Nazi regime, was brought upon the Jews in Germany and in the occupied territories. And in the name of the German people, unspeakable crimes were committed which call for moral and material restitution. That was more or less the opening speech, let me say it like this, the opening speech for what came later, which is known as the Luxembourg Agreement, also known as the Israel Agreement, and it's the compensation work that has started in 51 to 52, brought into papers, and it continues until today. And what we can see is that first it was, we talked about Germany's, what Germany did in the Nazi socialist area, and then you diminish the group of people who were suffering from this to the Jewish people, which, I mean, there were many others. The first who suffered were the communists. We have Sinti and Romas, we have homosexuals. They are not mentioned in this official paper on the website of the foreign ministry, which was updated in 2018. So it's really something from the present. So what I said before is, it gives me the chance to say some sentences about the so-called Luxembourg Agreement between the Federal Republic of Germany. And when I talk of Germany, I always mean West Germany, because it was completely different in that time still existing German Democratic Republic. And this was the agreement, the Luxembourg Agreement was between Germany and the State of Israel. With the Luxembourg Agreement, the Federal Republic undertakes to deliver goods to the State of Israel worth a total of 3 billion Deutsche Mark within a period of 12 years to support, integrate, and settle persecuted Jews who have acquired Israeli citizenship through immigration. And in addition, an arrangement with the Jewish Claims Conference against Germany comes into effect with the agreement, with the Luxembourg Agreement, that says 450 million D-Mark were used to support, integrate, and settle Jewish refugees outside of Israel. So this is in short something about the Luxembourg Agreement, which what we can say is there were interests of both sides. There was the interest, of course, of the German government and also the interest of the Israeli government. It was the father of the agreements were Konrad Adenauer on the one side, and Ben-Gurion on the other side, and both of them followed a logic of political interests. The German chancellor wanted to promote Germany's integration into the West and to forget the crimes, more or less, during the Nazi socialist regime, and this was a reparation was required, by the way, to get the integration to the West. And the Israeli Prime Minister Ben-Gurion wanted to accelerate the building of his own state. So the reparation that Germany paid was not individual victims got the money, but it was something that got to a certain burst, let me say it like this, and was paid to the building or helped a lot to build the State of Israel. So, and this continues, you know, then there were other agreements, like a very important one still until today, the armament cooperation that started already in 1954 at a very early stage, and then what I can say is that they were already exchanging of armaments, even though Germany at that time was not allowed to have to build arms, to construct arms. No, but Israel anyway got I forgot what it's some arms or boats or whatsoever, any kind of material. And to say it this way, long before Germany was there was an official diplomatic exchange, an embassy in Israel, one in Germany, between Israel and Germany, long before we had this armament cooperation that goes on until today, because now the latest is the drones. We have Germany leases drones from Israel, and the Bundeswehr people get trained in Israel. So the armament is the backbone of German-Israeli relations. And this is a question of money. I think the whole, it's not so much about victims. It's more about what does it help me on the economical sphere, on the political sphere, and strategically. And yes, it's a plus for both sides. So,
okay, Doris. Doris, thank you. Can I bring it back to something earlier? Our own glorious Winston Churchill was very clearly an extreme racist and a eugenicist, and he's on record to say, if a superior, more worldly race appears, then the natives in North America or Palestine or Africa have to give way. It seems that eugenicist idea drove what was happening in German Southwest Africa, Shaun. It seems to have been absolutely, well, was there a tension between those who wanted to enslave the native people and those who wanted to exterminate them?
Okay, so, I mean, we you know, I think we need to perhaps take it back to, I mean, Hitler, you know, admired the extermination of the Native Americans. Of course, we all know what the Spanish did in South America as well. But Hitler, of course, really, I mean, that was his, you know, his reference was always the extermination of the Native Americans. And that's really where a lot of this started. You know, so certainly, you know, Namibia, happened, of course, many years after, centuries even after this kind of thing happened in North America already. And I think it was very clear that the purpose of this colonial project certainly in Southern Africa was very much about the mineral wealth. Like I said, I mean, I think a real turning point was the discovery of diamonds and gold in South Africa. So for me, that is really the context, you know, that obviously local people resisted and the extermination, the genocide and so on happened in that kind of context, you know, to stop the resistance of the locals. I am not aware that you had this kind of tension, you know, between different factions of you know, of the colonizers. I think it was mainly a military response from their side. I mean, I think you had different. I mean, if you look at how the French, for example, their colonial project, perhaps had that kind of tension between different factions, different approaches. Whereas I think in our part of the world, it was mainly a military response. It was mainly extermination.
In the little bit of research I did, Shaun, for this discussion, I believe land also. I mean, obviously, Kimberley changed the whole dynamic of the colonization by the Brits, and also on a smaller scale in Namibia as well. But before that, there's also the standard settler colonial drive to bring in families and seize the land. And then you have a tension between keeping the natives as slave labor or semi-slave labor or getting rid of them. And there seems to have been an exterminatory drive in Southwest Africa, as there was in Tasmania or other parts of the British Empire. Does that make sense to you, Shaun?
Absolutely. I mean, the whole concept of Lebensraum, you know, that the purpose of this was, you know, to find Lebensraum in a place like Namibia. And, you know, like I said, with the extermination order of Mtota, the approach seemed to have been to simply get rid of the local population, not so much like in other parts of the world, where local populations were needed for cheap labor. In South Africa, for example, with the deep mines, is an example, it was a very different approach. You know, whereas in Namibia, it was so much about land and cattle. You know, they discovered a bit of diamonds in the southern part of Namibia, but it was a different colonial project compared to South Africa. You know, so yeah, so that was my sense of it. Like it was mainly about, you know, pushing people out of the territory, you know, of course taking the land and the cattle, because at that point certainly, you know, there wasn't really much focus on the minerals so much. It was more about finding Lebensraum.
Doris, does the Southwest Africa example demolish the German argument that these, you've already done it, you've shown how it was realpolitik to send weapons. There was an advantage to the German government, an advantage to the Israeli government, but they still, the popular idea remains that somehow the submarines and the billions that go from Berlin to Tel Aviv is somehow based on shame or penitence for the Nazi Holocaust. But this example from where Shaun is speaking seems to disprove that completely, does it not? There seems to be no shame whatsoever. Can you comment on that, Doris?
I think the term of shame is completely wrong in this context. It's called shame, it's called guilt, it's called responsibility. But first of all, we have to think about profit. And when it comes to Germany, we have to realize that Germany just throw away part of its history. All this is only about Nazi Germany. It's not about the history before. It's not about German colonialism. This is completely swept away. So I wouldn't talk about anything like a morality in this context. It's simply hypocrisy. I mean, even if you come to Nazi Germany, when you think of the Sinti and Roma that were exterminated in the same concentration camps like others, it took them a long time before they got acknowledged as a minority part in Germany, because before it was acknowledged that their murdering was also a genocide, all these things. So there is nothing like shame. There is nothing like, it's nothing. It's thinking about, it was a good opening to get good relationship at a very early stage. I mean, it was 5-6 years after everybody could see what happened in concentration camps. Then already Germany and Israel were in communication, made treaties, talked about, and it was an opening for both of them. But first of all, it was an opening for Germany to get into the Western family, or in the global North, or something like that. It has nothing to do with any morale, ethic, nothing. I disagree completely. I get crazy when they talk about their responsibility. They continue to allow murderings. They look away. Take Palestine, for example. It's the best example that there is nothing like ethics or moral. No, nothing.
Going forward, Shaun and Doris, going forward, we need to open up a space in Germany which has been closed down for advocacy for Palestine, to talk about what's happening there. We need to educate people about what's happening, what happened in Southwest Africa, the Congo, and across the whole of Africa in the so-called third world. So therefore, our interests, all our interests, I think we're on the left, I think we understand the big picture, but we have different focuses. Doris in Germany, in Berlin BDS, and yourself, Shaun, in Namibia. What's the degree of overlap? How going forward do we drive open space for conversation about Namibia, and at the same time open up space for advocacy for Palestine? Shaun, could you advise us how you see us going forward?
I mean, the Palestinian project is also a colonial project, and one would hope, you know, that people in Germany would make that connection between Namibia and Palestine in that sense, you know, that in many ways we are speaking about the same struggle. You know, for us, we obviously, I mean, we fully support, you know, the legitimate struggle of the Palestinian people. There's no debate about it whatsoever. And for us in Namibia, we understand it because of our own history of dispossession and colonialism. because that's really what we are speaking about. For us, the creation of Israel after the Second World War has to be seen in the context of the rise of American imperialism, control of the global economy, especially the flow of oil, and of course the start of the Cold War. And I think we have to be able to situate Palestine in that broader context. In Germany, you had powerful companies, IG Farben, of course, who worked very closely with Standard Oil in the US. They had tremendous economic interest in supporting the Nazis and, of course, making sure, that the Americans come out on top at the end of the Second World War. We really have to remember that Hitler's main target was actually the Bolsheviks, and all, so a lot of these other things, of course, were very tragic, but ultimately it was about, being able to stop the Bolsheviks, stop the German Revolution, and so on. I think so there's that broader context that we have to understand. But once again, in terms of Palestine itself, I don't know how many people know, Nick, that that the Western Cape in South Africa was one possible place for the Jewish homeland. That was on the table, at the United Nations at the time. And it was really through the intervention of Jan Smuts that it didn't happen. But of course,
I think Doris and I probably know that they were allocated a piece of Kenya called Uganda at the time. They considered Patagonia and even Cyprus, but that's new to me, Shaun. I didn't know that they were looking also at a piece of Southern Africa.
Yes, the Western Cape was one possible place as well. Okay, but look, Palestine had many advantages in terms of the control of the Middle East, the control of the flow of oil. And if you control oil, you control the global economy. And once again, we had these very powerful corporations, who were really calling the shots behind the scenes. IG Farben in Southern Africa, of course, the Anglo-American Corporation. So when we speak about reparations, we also need to be able to talk about these huge corporations that benefited, from colonialism, from these slave camps and so on. And look, in terms of our view at this point in Namibia is that we accept that reparations will not happen soon. And perhaps an alternative political strategy would be to focus on redistribution of wealth locally. In Israel at the moment, of course, you have a mass uprising against the Netanyahu dictatorship. The working class, the youth of Israel are in the streets protesting against the economic crisis, the unemployment. And perhaps the way forward is to have this kind of unity between the Palestinian Arab working class and the Israeli working class. And perhaps, have that kind of focus, as at the moment we are we are in a position of weakness as far as reparations are concerned.
Doris, you want to take that forward? But before you do, a footnote to a footnote, Shaun, is that not only did IG Farben survive the war, but the same people who produced Zyklon B gas for some of the concentration camps, IG Farben, later got the contract for a special chemical to coat the Jewish Holocaust Memorial in Berlin to prevent graffiti. And when the Jewish community in Berlin, the remnants, complained about that, the German government said something like, well, if we stop IG Farben, where will it end? All these corporations were involved. Doris, moving forward, naive people, Facebook's full of brilliant stuff and also great stupidity. But a lot of people who sympathize with the Palestinians seem to think, because of the brutality of Israel, the cruelty, the sadism, and so on, that Israel is a sort of ahistorical phenomenon. It just it came from hell. People use the word Israel as, rhetorical extremism and seemingly understand nothing. Isn't it necessary to to demystify that and to show Israel as every settler colonialism is specific. We've all got but it's a bog standard example of settler colonialism, is it not? And so therefore, isn't our education about Palestine, isn't it essential to talk about Southwest Africa, Argentina, Brazil, settler colonialisms across the world? Otherwise, people don't have a frame of reference and they kind of get misled. Doris, and then Shaun, please.
It is important to talk about settler colonialism when we talk about Israel, but in Germany, you will, I mean, when we talk about, for the German majority, I think Israel does not start in 1904. It starts in 1947 with the partition plan, and it continues with the foundation of the State of Israel sometime later, and that's it. I think many people in Germany do not think about settler colonialism or even colonialism when they think about Israel. Israel is the answer to the Shoah. It's not, the history before does not count. So the problem is that there should be another education in schools. I mean, when I remember my school time, which was sometimes in the 50s and the 60s, I didn't know anything about colonialism or settler colonialism. I knew that there are some, with Germany or the Kaiserreich, the empire had some colonies somewhere in Africa, and that was over with World War I. But that there were other settler colonial constructions. No, we didn't know. We weren't educated on that, and I think that is until today. I would not like ask people who go to school today whether they, when they talk about the history of Palestine and in that the history of Israel, I'm sure there will be nothing that you will hear something about Balfour Declaration, and you think it's normal that someone in Britain promises part of lands somewhere far away from the UK. So I think the question of settler colonialism is not raised yet in Germany. Not among, I mean, of course, within the Palestine Solidarity Movement, of course, but not in general.
Shaun, do you want to add to that?
Absolutely. I mean, my sense, Nick and Doris, is that the propaganda machine, of course, works so very well. I mean, if you think about, who controls the global mass media, and who controls the agenda very much. I mean, I think there's this perception, that Israel has historically belonged to the Jewish people. It's been like that for thousands of years. I think that's the narrative out there. So there's nothing about, the super apartheid in Palestine. There's nothing about, the dispossession of the Palestinian people. So it's a reflection of how very effective that propaganda machine is out there. And of course, we understand, the importance of the BDS movement. We lived through apartheid. We understood the tremendous impact the boycott, the global boycott had against the apartheid regime. And that is a very important strategy, of course, against this Israeli regime. There's no debate about it, that must continue. But of course, it is very difficult because like I said, if you consider, who owns the media in the US, in Europe, in Australia, and so on, then of course, it's a tough battle for us, but of course, we will continue. There is no, I always say what is happening to the Palestinians are so much worse than what happened to us under apartheid. And that's the reality of it. Not the propaganda, the stuff, from the propaganda machine, but the reality of what's happening to people on the ground in Palestine, the open air prison of Gaza. Look, I can tell you the apartheid regime would not have dared, to bomb the townships in those days. They would not have dared to do something like that. Whereas, of course, the Israeli regime gets away with it. It is horrible, But the apartheid regime would not have dared to do something like that. So it's very much a reflection of, the conservative narrative that is out there in the mainstream media.
So strategic considerations protect Israel its allies in Britain, Germany, the USA protect it, is that partly because if they didn't protect it, then there's a public opinion which is actually quite hostile to what Israel is doing, Doris?
Yeah, that's true. And especially in Germany, kind of, you know, the atmosphere is first, enough is enough. Now it's over. It's not my thing. I'm a post-Nazi German person. That's a very strong attitude, and on the one side, but on the other side, when Germany and the Germany of today, but having in mind Germany's history, when they consider all the crimes that have been committed in the name of Germany, then it would be an endless chain of Germany was involved in every murderous situation. It was not only starting with Namibia, with Hireo and Nama. Think of the Armenians. Think of other crimes committed in the name of Germany. So it's a long story. So if they count to all that, then Germany has a lot to do on moral and ethic standards, and would be good. I would very much appreciate that, because then it could become kind of what Shaun is mentioning all the time, kind of revolutionary Germany. Not a powerful, not a global player, but a Germany that thinks about its history, and not only a short part of it, but the whole part of it, at least until starting from 1871, when the Germany became a state in its own.
So the Palestinians have disappeared very much from the news, but refugees have disappeared from the news. I'm listening to the radio this morning, and my God, horror, horror, 121 refugees and asylum seekers came to Britain last night.
Wow.
And the media, it's just incredible, isn't it? And
Yeah.
all they care about is the number. This is to frighten people. We don't know their names. Nobody, no journalist went to the beach to speak to one of them to say where they came from and what they suffered. It's disgusting. It's really an outpouring of, you know, it's to whip up jingoism. It's to dehumanize these people or deny them their humanity. So Shaun, the Palestinians have disappeared. The Herero and the Nama people have disappeared from history here in the West. We really need to have a coherent view of what's going on in the world in order to understand what's happening in Israel-Palestine. Do we know it? Do you want, Shaun, make some closing remarks? I'm absolutely delighted to have you in here today from, how do you pronounce the capital of Namibia?
Windhoek.
I nearly got Windhoek. What an idiot I am. Windhoek, I've got it. Okay, that defeated me. Now I've got it. I'm grateful to you for two things, Shaun, being here today and telling me how to pronounce Windhoek. Shaun, make some concluding remarks in the light of what you and Doris have said earlier, please.
Yeah, look, I mean, for me, Mick, one of the important lessons from the anti-apartheid movement was that, you know, we had a very strong movement in the USA. And I think that made a huge difference in terms of the downfall of that apartheid regime. You know, so ultimately, in terms of, you know, the Palestinian question, I think that is a crucial strategy to look at. You know, if one could build obviously a strong BDS in Germany, a strong BDS in Britain, and definitely in the US, it would go a long way in terms of, you know, stopping the colonial project in Palestine.
And also, Shaun, sorry I interrupt you, but also, in your concluding remarks, there's a massive Black Lives Matter movement. It's really influenced us even here in Scotland. People are moving. What's the relationship between raising the issue of Palestine and an apartheid state and exterminations and colonialism and the domestic fight against racism? Can those two be separated, or are they indissoluble? Shaun, final remarks.
Palestinian lives matter. Namibians' lives matter. I mean, you know, we have to be able to make that link. You know, this Black Lives Matter movement is welcome because it is a global anti-racist movement. And we need to be able to link the Palestinian struggle, the Namibian struggles, struggles all over with that, you know, that we need to really get rid of racism.
So what do you say to those people who want to separate a supposedly domestic struggle against racism with that bigger picture? Doris?
Could you repeat your question? Sorry.
It's just dotting the T's and it's crossing the T's and dotting the I's. What do you, I mean, just to build on what you said, but can you include, what would you say to some people who say in Britain, I'm sorry, it's real, that the struggle against racism domestically needs a broad front. We don't want to bring in anti-imperialism or Palestine. It's a divisive issue. So let's march against racism and let's even allow Israeli flags on the march. What's your comments?
If we take it seriously to march against racism, then we have to think first about joint struggles with what Shaun said before, with people from Namibia, with Palestinians, with Kashmiris, with, I mean, the line is long. The line is long. And if there are people with Israeli flags, then you could ask them, okay, what are you doing at home when you go here with Israeli flag and come from a racist state? It's the same when you wear a German flag. I mean, this would be a contradiction in itself. So no flags at that point. But to remember joint struggles and to be together and to make no priority, but to realize that when you are against racism, you have to be completely against racism. You cannot be half pregnant, you know, and you cannot be half anti-racist. That doesn't work. So you have to be very clear on that on every level.
Shaun Whittaker in Windhoek, Namibia. Doris Ghannam in Berlin. I started off never having spoken to you before, Shaun. I've known Doris for a very long time. She's been to major protests here in Edinburgh. But I hope going forward, Shaun, that we'll be able to work together, because I do see it as important, and perhaps even in a certain sense, starting from where we are, the struggle for recognition of the genocides in Southwest Africa and the issue of German government repression of Palestine advocacy can usefully be brought together, as we're trying to do here today. So Shaun and Doris, thank you very much for joining us today, and I hope we'll meet again. Friends, I've just got a few announcements to make. We in Scottish PSC, we do a daily post, a WhatsApp post to those who are interested. We put a lot of work into it. We hope it's useful. We hope it's informative. We hope it frames the struggle going forward. We need ideas, but we need acts as well, and it's that blend that we're trying to improve constantly. So this is Mick Napier. At 4 o'clock today, I'm interviewing I'll have a conversation with Chris Williamson, an ex-Labour MP. I think the only one. He was driven out of the Labour Party. But he wasn't driven out of the Labour Party for anti-Semitism. He was driven out because he questioned whether the Labour Party was dealing with these false accusations of anti-Semitism properly. So he got chucked out because he questioned the fact that other people had been chucked out. And now, I guess if I speak to him this afternoon at 4 o'clock, as I will, my application to the Labour Party will be rejected because I've been on the same broadcast as Chris Williamson. But it'll be an honour to have him. He's a bonny fighter, and he has a lot to talk about the false accusations, the false witch hunts. But once again, for the last time, this is Mick Napier from Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Shaun Whittaker from Namibia, Doris Ghannam from Berlin. A very good afternoon to everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you. All the best.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Go
It was a
well.
pleasure being with you. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye, Doris. Bye-bye, Nick.